leading off is one of the most remarkable people in all of Washington, John Gizzi. John Gizzi hasn't quite been, in the favorite expression of Dean Acheson, present at the creation, but it was shortly after the creation that John Gizzi showed up in Washington, and he knows everyone who has traversed the halls of Congress and the White House since then. He is an extraordinary journalist, an absolute encyclopedia of political information. For many years, he worked for the wonderful publication Human Events. He has since moved on to Newsmax. And Newsmax, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but recently was an initial public offering of Newsmax stock. The Newsmax IPO has been an absolute phenomenon, and it's indicative of the number of people who are discovering this additional voice on the right, a voice of reason, and one of the bright lights in Newsmax is John Gizzi. John has been at, I think, every single PLC, which would put him at 36 now. He is truly an institution among us, but more important, he is a patriot and somebody who looks at the body politic from the perspective of a conservative philosophy. He also happens to have this extraordinary memory and the ability to speak extemporaneously on virtually any topic for as long as you will give him. That will be my challenge this morning. Please welcome John Gizzi.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. Thank you, Colin, and thank you, my dear friends, for being here this morning. As Angelina Jolie once said to Brad Pitt, I won't keep you long. Colin said it best. Newsmax has gone public. The initial public offering has been a big success. I was proud to be there on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange Thursday morning, just before I came to PLC. Jeff Lord was with me, and it was, needless to say, a morning to remember. I don't think I'll forget the sight of our president, Chris Ruddy, who had started Newsmax with very little and the help of a great son of Pennsylvania, Richard Mellon Scaife, years ago, taking it from a pamphlet to a newsletter to an online publication, and now one of the fourth most watched television networks in the United States. And it was a great sight to see him now take Newsmax public and do this. I'm always happy to be at PLC, and as Colin said, I was here at the beginning, present at the creation, you might say, back in 1989. What I cherish most about these conclaves is the friends that I've made over the years. So many I consider people near and dear to my heart. Colin, Jeff, Lohman, Jeff Goldberg, and Kurt Schroeder. All true friends, and I am so glad they're all here today, as I am that all of you are here. Some, of course, cannot be here today, but as William Buckley once said, they are not present but well accounted for. Tom Smith, your former Senate nominee, Sue Staub, who convinced me to go to the first PLC in 1989, and of course, Fred Anton, without whom none of us would be here this morning. I am glad to count them as friends, all living proof, as Emerson said, that the only way to have a friend is to be one. Now, how many of you saw the movie about Ronald Reagan? Isn't it just amazing that 20 years after his death, more than 40 years, 45 in fact, since his election as president, Ronald Reagan is still warmly thought of, not only by those who covered him and remembered his presidency, but those who simply have read about him. And that movie summed it up. So many saw the movie, which was based on a book by our friend Paul Kanger. You know, Ronald Reagan had a great sense of humor, and I think he would have seen the humor in the fact that so many not-so-conservative Republicans and not-so-conservative people in general who said Reagan could never be elected in 1980 are now saying that Donald Trump could not be elected in 2016 or 2024. And inevitably they'll say, well, he's no Ronald Reagan. Well, a funny thing happened to Donald Trump on his way to the junk heap of history. He won. And I find it most interesting to see that the Never Reagan supporters or anybody but Reagan team became the Never Trumpers many years later. Now, of course, Ronald Reagan is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan, any more than Reagan was not Dwight Eisenhower and not Abraham Lincoln. God gives us the leaders we deserve, and history shows He also gives us the leaders we need as the issues change and the times change to approach them. Let's look at just two issues regarding Trump and Reagan. First, the issue of immigration. Ronald Reagan had some definite thoughts about this issue. Like many of his contemporaries, he believed legal immigration was a good thing for the United States of America, and he supported it. And according to Ed Meese, his Attorney General, he also believed in the quotas that the United States had for immigrants for 44 years, right up until 1965, meaning that the people who got to the front of the line and got in were those who could assimilate easiest and would do the most for the United States of America. And it was with reluctance that in 1986, President Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, commonly known as Simpson-Mazzoli. Now, this was an amnesty, and President Reagan said so. It permitted the naturalization of 4 million people who were in the United States illegally. In Reagan's words, it allowed them to come out of the shadows, and they did. But he also made it clear he was doing this reluctantly. He knew that the bill was an amnesty, and he would only do it once, he said, because it also contained strict penalties for employers who knowingly hired non-citizens to work. Well, none of those laws have been enforced over the last 4 decades. And when the Biden administration began, the number of people in the United States illegally were estimated at 11 million. That was in 2021. That figure can only have gone up in the last 4 years. Hence, Donald Trump is finishing the job that Ronald Reagan started, which was to end illegal immigration. Hence, the deportations that we see on television and the policy of this administration. In that sense, you could say that Donald Trump is the keeper of Ronald Reagan's flame. So it is on the issue of smaller government. Government that's small is something that all of us as conservatives favor, putting the emphasis on the individual. And one case in point of this that comes up repeatedly these days is abolishing the Department of Education. Perhaps you don't know this, That appeared in the Republican platform for the first time in 1980, and Governor Reagan campaigned on it very hard. As president, he spoke repeatedly about the need to close down the Department of Education and return control to states, localities, and parents. In his memoirs, Ted Bell, President Reagan's first Secretary of Education, said every time he got to talk to the president, he would begin each conversation by saying, "How are you coming on abolishing that department of yours?" Well, he didn't. When William Bennett was named as his second Secretary of Education, he told his Senate confirmation hearing that if a motion ever came up to abolish the Department of Education, it would probably get 10 votes at the most. And it was removed from the Republican platform by George W. Bush. I well remember covering the platform committees at the 2000 Republican Convention, right here in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, in fact. And I asked then Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, the chairman of the platform committee, why removing the Department of Education was coming out of the platform, and did he favor federal control of education? Governor Thompson replied, "I favor winning election." And so it was, the philosophy that if one talked about closing down the Department of Education, rightly or wrongly, he or she would be perceived as being against public education or even burning down the little schoolhouse. In 2024, abolishing the Department of Education was put back in the Republican platform. And Donald Trump, with executive orders, has started the process that will take an act of Congress to finally enforce and to close the department down. I might add one more thing on this, that this issue is not going to go away. Increasingly, candidates for office around the country campaign on it and support abolishing the Department of Education. Now, one could say that perhaps these efforts to close it down and to shut down other government agencies are going a bit too far, that a scalpel could be used instead of a sledgehammer. I would submit the other viewpoint that was voiced by M. Stanton Evans, my friend and a great conservative journalist, and he's dinner speaker at the 1990 Pennsylvania Leadership Conference, who said sometimes a brawler is needed rather than an expert to get the job done. That's why Donald Trump is there. One other figure for you to share. Right now, the operating budget of the Department of Education is $268 billion per year. That means that it is the sixth largest government agency and 4% of the overall $68 trillion that is spent by government every year. 8% of that figure, 8%, comes from Pennsylvania taxpayers. Can you imagine if 8% of $268 billion were returned to all of you, to the parents in Pennsylvania, who could then apply it to improving local public schools and, if failing that, send their children to charter schools or private schools? A return of that money, accomplished by abolishing the Department of Education, would make education in the Keystone State bubble. I might add that this mission is going to continue, critical press notwithstanding. On a personal note, I would just add, speed is important, but success is imperative. Now, you know, I said how much I enjoyed coming to the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference, and indeed, it is a treat What I enjoy most is the fact that there are disagreements all the time from the disparate factions of conservatism. You know what I mean. The cultural conservatives argue with the economic conservatives. The neoconservatives fight with the paleoconservatives. And the libertarians fight with just about everyone. But in the end, everyone comes together when they leave this hotel in Harrisburg, and sometimes you go on to do great things, like defeating a 3-term Democratic senator with Dave McCormick. The 18th century French philosopher Joseph Joubert said it best, that it's better to debate without settling than to settle without debate. And I say that not because I'm probably the only person in this room old enough to have heard him say it. You know, I want to leave you with the words of someone many of us knew, we certainly all heard of and read of, and some of us got to know personally. He was a small-town lawyer like Lincoln, and after service in the military, got into politics in his hometown. He was elected United States Senator from California, and had his career not taken some unusual twists and turns, at the last time we spoke, he would have been seeking his 8th term in the Senate. He had done me a personal favor, and I went to thank him for it. We were at an event, and as I turned to leave after thanking him, he reached out, grabbed both of my arms, and pulled me toward him and said, "We've saved freedom abroad. The question now is, can we save freedom at home?" What Richard Nixon told me that day, I will never forget. I think of it often when I come to PLC and I see the mission that all of you carry out. It is summed up also in the title of a book by Stan Evans, whom I mentioned. The theme is freedom. Please go forward with that, keeping in mind the words of Richard Nixon and also the admonition of the Apostle Paul to the Galatians. Never grow weary of doing good deeds, because at the proper time there will be a harvest if we don't give up. Thy will be done. Thank you all.